The Holy Gospel according to St. Mark, the 7th chapter. Now when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders. And they do not eat anything from the market unless they wash it. And there are also many other traditions that they observe, the washing of cups, pots, and bronze kettles. So the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" He said to them, "Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human traditions.'" Then he called the crowd again and said to them, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come." The Gospel of the Lord.
Traditions and rules shape our lives. But it's interesting to realize how we adhere to such rules and traditions without ever giving much thought as to why we behave as we do. Take, for example, what was said to us as children before mealtime. Most of us can remember our mothers saying something like, "Now be sure to wash your hands before coming to the table." Now, if we were to have questioned the practice of washing our hands before meals, Mom's response would probably have varied according to her mood. If she'd had a long day, perhaps exasperating, she may have said, "Because I told you to." And if her goal was to teach us a moral lesson, what we might have heard was, "Because cleanliness is next to godliness." And occasionally we got the whole hygiene lesson. Dirty hands carry germs that will make us sick. Well, in these days of pandemic, as we live in antiseptic America, where everything is sterilized and sanitized, the response that makes the most sense to us is, of course, the last. We've become hypersensitive to germs that makes a fetish of personal hygiene. Today, therefore, washed hands or using hand sanitizer for us has become a symbol of being not just a proper, healthy person, but one who is responsible for his, her, their own health and the health of others and the larger community. In today's gospel lesson, the Pharisees and scribes are critical of Jesus' disciples because they fail to wash their hands before eating. However, back then it was not an issue of personal hygiene, but of spiritual worthiness. For the Pharisees and scribes, it was not a matter of germs, but of godliness. Their chief concern was not dirt, but defilement. You see, the act of washing one's hands was a religious ritual, a sacred ceremony that was required in order for a person to be right with God. Now really, the Pharisees and teachers of the law weren't criticizing the disciples, they were attacking Jesus. For if he were a real teacher of the law, he would teach according to the tradition of the elders and come to eat with clean, that is, properly washed hands. Well, the gospel lesson also includes some other requirements of their law. For example, when they came from the marketplace, they were to wash, to purify themselves, because while they were shopping, they might just have accidentally bumped up against a Gentile. Well, now you have to understand that these rules were not from the law of Moses. They were not given by God, but they were part of what was called the oral tradition. It was like this hedge that had grown up around the law of God, not the law of God, but the laws of men, or as the lesson says, the tradition of the elders. Jesus responds to their criticism with, "You hypocrites, Isaiah described you perfectly." And then Jesus quotes from Isaiah as he says something like, You're so busy holding on to the traditions of religion that you have let go of the commandments of God. You people pay God lip service. Your heart isn't in it. Your worship of God is in vain because you teach as doctrine the commandments of men. You ignore what God has commanded, and you cling to what has been handed down to you. Well, as if that weren't enough, to put the Pharisees and scribes in their place, Jesus gathers this crowd and says to them, "Hear me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile." The religious hypocrites were concerned with clean hands. Jesus was concerned with inward sincerity, not outward behaviors. He was concerned with clean hearts. The Pharisees and scribes took enormous pride in their perfected performance of outward obedience to the law. And Jesus cuts through this superficial surface understanding to the real heart of the matter, to what was going on in the center of a person's being. And in so doing, he reveals that it does little good to change what people do until you deal with and change that which causes them to do it in the first place. You see, as humans, we create on the outside what it is we're experiencing on the inside. In other words, what's going on inside our hearts at this very moment will eventually find its way to the surface. We can't help it. It's just what we do. And it's why Jesus was always looking at the heart of people he met, and it's why he's more concerned with what's going on inside of your heart right now than he is with what you did last Friday night. This is where the gospel speaks to us. Would you humor me for a second? Would you place your hands out in front of you? Go ahead. And I bet what you see are very, very clean hands. But if I asked you to take your heart and to hold your heart out in front of you, how clean, how perfectly clean would your heart be? You know, Jesus made it quite clear that if you even think an evil thought, you are as guilty as if you've done an evil deed. Well, given such a standard for righteousness and cleanliness, is there anybody here, anybody watching, who can stand before God and be declared innocent and clean? One day some boys decided to get back at a cantankerous old neighbor who would not let them play ball in his vacant lot. His house had been freshly painted, and it was his pride and joy. After a rainstorm, the boys hid in the bushes. And while the three younger boys made mud balls, their elder brother, with the stronger arm, pelted the newly painted house with one mud ball after another. Well, their father met the boys as they were coming home. He'd already heard what had happened, and so he was ready to confront them. "Who did it?" he asked. Each pleaded innocence. "Okay," said the father. "The one who has muddy hands is the guilty one." Well, each boy held out his hands, and it was obvious that all were guilty. The hands of the three smaller boys who made the mud balls were just as muddy as the hands of the older brother who had thrown them. Jesus reveals to us a radical standard of righteousness, not to frustrate and confuse us, but to bring us to the realization that we share collectively the responsibility for the tragic condition of the world. You see, having clean hands is a deception, because it's so easy then to convince ourselves that we are not responsible for the predicaments in the world, let alone the drama in our own lives. Clean on the outside, clean on the inside. But what we need to do is to face up to the condition of our hearts. To some degree, we share the guilt of the world's muddy hands within our own muddy hearts. We have met the enemy, and it is us. But Jesus' outlook on the human heart needs careful qualification. For example, Jesus does not denounce the heart for producing only evil intentions, for we know that the human heart is capable of profound acts of kindness and good and selfless compassion. Nonetheless, it's not the scribes nor the Pharisees, nor the law Jesus aims the dagger of his remarks but to the human being. 11 times these verses use the Greek word anthropon, which means human being or person. From anthropon, we get the word anthropology. You see, the basic problem is not even bad traditions, how or what one should eat, but the internal problem of the anthropon. It is this malignancy that chokes the life out of tradition, turns it into an enemy of God, contorts it into a way of excusing injustice, and blinds those afflicted by it to their own culpability for the evils that trouble the world. Now notice, this means that Satan did not make you do it. Christians are notorious for blaming something outside of themselves for thoughts and deeds that they'd rather not take responsibility for. That job belongs to the human heart. Placing blame on a diabolical entity lurking in the shadows risks diverting attention from our own proclivity to rebel and destroy. Truly, evil intentions dwell not only within society's notorious figures, but within ourselves and those we love and trust most fervently. And yet we know enough about the human condition to say that evil is about more than an individual's selfishness or bad decision. It roams our collective existence, our social, economic, and family systems. We are at the same time perpetrators and victims, and our victimization often furthers our capacity to perpetrate. The human heart or the human will remains a complex thing. Sadly but true, our relationships and culture usually keep us ingrained in patterns of self-destructiveness. We can push against Jesus' idea of defilement because that's not even a term we use in our day. Jesus says there is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile. But no recovering addict I know would ever say that ingestion, taking something into one's body, and what it does to the human heart, the center of our being, that those two things are unrelated. It is a cliche and also true to say that in our culture we use food and mood-altering substances to self-medicate for spiritual issues like emptiness, pain, boredom, anxiety, and loneliness. The issue here is not ritual defilement, but rather what effect such things as guilt and shame and other things that lurk within us have on our own indulgences and our powerlessness over them, our self-defilement, if you will. Even if our spiritual hearts are immune to contamination from the preservatives and Pringles, our souls are indiscriminate and relentless consumers, imprinted and formed by everything to which they are exposed. In this respect, many things outside a person can defile. Watching too much news constantly, or maybe watching the same episode of Schitt's Creek for the umpteenth time. This includes how we take into ourselves the fantasy that's out there, that if we just win the lottery, if we just find the right romance, even get the right president in office, all that out there will make this in here feel better. These things do not move cleanly through our various tracts and systems and out into the sewer. Rather, they flatten us, they desensitize and anesthetize us. They skew our perspective and thereby deform the very hearts from which evil intentions come. So what is the gracious remedy? Well, Jesus' teaching is intended to shock us into an awareness of our total and complete need of one beyond ourselves. For to each and every broken anthropon is extended the love and mercy of God, who asks of us only one thing. Not a perfect life, not even to be a good little boy, girl, or gender fluid they even. God wants only one thing of you and one thing of me. God wants a sincere heart, truthfulness, honesty, and that you are in this thing called life with everything you are, those good things about your heart. And I know you well enough to know there are a lot of good things. But God recognizes the other side of the coin, that there is evil lurking in the shadows. And that's why we sometimes hurt those we love, why we make poor decisions, and why we seem to succeed in making the world even less of a nice place to live than better. But I tell you, it's God that has a gentle awareness of this aspect of our humanity. And it's God that invites us to reflect that same gentle awareness toward others, and maybe even more especially toward ourselves. Here's a modern translation of Psalm 51. And I invite you simply to allow these words to break through any resistance you may have to simply letting God love you, affirming you exactly where you are in your life and not where you think you should be, because you know something? Nobody watching this video is where he or she or they should be. And neither is the world where it should be. But somehow we ended up here in whatever place we are with whatever baggage we've accumulated along the way. Allow God's Spirit to bring grace to the troubled places of your own spirit, to the broken places of relationship that you know, to the ongoing struggle you have with an aging body, those destructive voices of self-criticism. Here is the prayer of the psalmist.